So yeah, on that first post, you write that you're perhaps the only behaviorist evolutionary psychologist. So my question is rather obvious. One, what does that mean? Can you spell out what this means for people? I assume most people watching this obviously have a good understanding of evo sci. So what does the extra adjective mean? Is that really true? And if it is, why?
When I was, learning evolutionary psychology, I'd always heard behaviorism presented as antithetical to evolutionary psychology. And certainly many behaviorists who work on human behavior think that there are a few general purpose learning mechanisms that govern our behavior, whereas evolutionary psychologists think that there are a large number of specific, what they call modules. These are mental programs that help us organize, process, and produce behavior in specific domains. Things that David Buss used to like to say to his evolutionary psychology class is, you might look for a crispy vegetable, but you don't want a crispy mate. So you want to make sure you're using a specific module for mate choice. You don't have one module for vegetable choice and the same module for mate choice. And I think that most evolutionary psychologists, have no interest in behaviorism and are not behaviorists in any way, just because they don't know anything about behaviorism and because they don't see how behaviorism actually plugs into our evolved psychology. And behaviorists, for their part, tend to be the most hostile to evolutionary psychology. There's a lot of people who are hostile to evolutionary psychology, a lot of clinicians, clinical psych people, some cognitive psych people, but behaviorists seem to have, I'm generalizing because there are exceptions, very little interest in evolutionary psychology. So I just think it's not these two fields haven't really been married, not necessarily because they're antithetical to each other, but because people think they are antithetical to one another. And yeah, that's it.
So what I found really interesting here is the history of behaviorism and the cognitive revolution. Chomsky writes that, I mean, it goes obviously before Chomsky, you got Piaget and whatever, but anyway, the story that most people who are interested in this stuff know is that Chomsky writes this searing critique of Skinner. And then you have people further down the line like Seligman, learned helplessness, and behaviorism seems to just fade away. There's this huge emphasis, I guess, on the brain, because then we start to develop the tools to be able to do all these fMRI scans, EEG, whatever. But when I look at, for example, if you look at A-level psychology, the pre-university qualification in the UK, or just a undergrad textbook, and or you just Google best criticisms of behaviorism, I don't quite understand how behaviorism has went away so quietly. I guess you sent me that article. I don't know where it was from. The 12-page one where you're basically outlining what it means, what behaviorist evolutionary psychology can offer. So why is this not more popular? And can you explain to people actually its use value, where it can even outpredict evo sci?
Sure. I'll put that up on my Substack. It's on my old blog, but I'll put it up on my Substack before this interview goes out. So I don't think behaviorism faded away necessarily. People were finding exceptions to what were thought to be these very large rules. And it's possible that behaviorism was kind of promising too much, such that when people found things like learned helplessness, or, Garcia was studying things like superstimuli, these things, or what do they call that? Instinct. There's a thing where, like, if you train a raccoon to exchange coins for food with you, eventually they won't want to give you the coin back, and they start washing the coin like they wash their food. I think it's called like instinct preservation. Right. So there's these various exceptions, and I think people were saying that debunked, behaviorism, but people still use behaviorist principles to train dogs, in special education to train animals. And, there are even some behaviorist books about using behaviorism in industry and at companies and in order to manage people. There is behaviorism all around us. It's just, I think Skinner maybe promised too much. As far as an evolutionary psych of behaviorism or behaviorist evolutionary psychology, the point that I make in that essay is that if rewards and punishments are the best ways to change other people's behavior, then we must have an instantiation of behaviorist principles in our behavior towards other people. And I talk about how you can see rewards and punishments in a lot of different relationships. So one of the big problems that evolutionary psychologists talk about a lot is like the problem of cooperation. How do you get selfish organisms or organisms that are generally selfish other than to pursue their genetic interests to cooperate? And there are many times where cooperating makes the most sense from a selfish point of view. But if you want to change any behavior of any organism in a specific direction, using shaping, using iterated rewards is the best way to do that. And it would be very surprising to me if our evolutionary psychology didn't have that instantiated. And because I worked with David Buss and because I'm interested in relationships, what is the most high stakes relationship that we have as humans that isn't, naturally cooperative, right? Where two people are not necessarily aligned in their genetic interests, and those are romantic partnerships. So it seemed to me that we're going to see a lot of behaviorist interventions that are intuitively practiced in interpersonal relationships. But in that essay, I talk about some other things as well. There's this, at the time that I started graduate school, David Buss had written a book called The Murderer Next Door. And there was a kind of interesting and spirited debate in evolutionary psychology about the origin of murder. So, why do we murder each other? Why is murder a fairly common occurrence in more ancestral societies? And Daly and Wilson, who wrote an incredible book called Homicide, where they talk about all these different kinds of homicides. They think it's just a byproduct. You want to intimidate somebody else and then you kind of accidentally kill them. The only, ironically, actual murder that they say is possibly adaptive in and of itself is infanticide, which is the most common form of homicide in most places. I'm hedging my bets here. I think it's the most common form of homicide, full stop. And David Buss wrote this whole book about homicide as an adaptation. But there's a lot of other questions, so step parents are the most likely to kill children. Why do step parents, from an evolutionary perspective, why would you bother beating your stepchild or verbally abusing them or whatever? It seems like a kind of waste of effort. And you can really only understand that from an evolutionary perspective, right? If somebody's soliciting resources from you, you don't want to give them resources. You punish their solicitation so they stop soliciting resources from you. Abuse really only makes sense from a behaviorist perspective.
Do you think that part of the reason behaviorism faded away is because it also became, if we talk about the period, obviously 60s, 70s, this is when the cognitive revolution is really about to hit its peak, and obviously what's going on in American society at that time with the civil rights movement, and the origins of behaviorism, and I guess maybe like some of the implicit values that people can be easily coerced, then perhaps they should be, because if you're not going to do it, someone else will. Do you think that also played a role? It was just kind of seen as undesirable.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of things that people hate about behaviorism, which is, I'm really drawn to things that other people find offensive. So people love the idea that we have free will and behaviorism is deterministic. People like the idea that, let's say I ask you why you like that pair of shoes instead of that pair of shoes, or why you engage in certain behaviors, right? People like the idea that you can ask somebody about why they do things and their explanation means something. Whereas behaviorists, by and large, say, asking people for explanations of their behavior is not really, you don't get a lot of information that way. You just observe them. You observe what they do in various different environments, and in response to various different stimuli, and you figure out what people's preferences are, more honestly, that way. And some of the stuff that is attributed to Skinner, is not always true, but he was a character who liked to talk about behaviorism as being able to solve all of society's problems. And after these holes were poked in it, that's why I think it collapsed a bit. But he does talk about private behavior, or which are things like thoughts. But he also says you don't necessarily need access to those things. And with the cognitive revolution, that it just became much less fashionable, the idea that you could tell everything you needed to. And I think people, if you look about humanism and things like that, people are offended that you could understand human behavior by studying rats and pigeons. Even now, there's a guy called Alfie Kohn who wrote Punished by Rewards. He's a very big critic of behaviorism. And I had seen his name all over the place. So I listened to several different interviews with him. And he's just constantly talking about how offensive it is to use dog training techniques on people. And so I think all these things, and if you read Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which I'll talk about it now a little bit, it anticipates many of these problems that people have with it, that people don't like the idea that human beings are easily predicted, or can be predicted, with these laws. And what I think, that I don't think Skinner necessarily goes so far as to say, is that people behave in a protean way. They behave in unpredictable ways as an adaptation against control itself.
Do you see a lot of similarities in the way that behavior genetics has been received, precisely because of that deterministic thrust that it has right at the core?
Yeah, I have something that I've been thinking about, but I don't know how much of this is, accounts for the zeitgeist we see now, where people are talking about not being a specific race or ethnicity. People are disavowing their, traditions, and also talking about being agender, non-binary, or having these various different unusual forms of identity. But I think people are profoundly averse to control. And part of being profoundly averse to control is being averse to even being categorized, or having things about you that can predict you. You see a huge outcry if somebody says something to do with physiognomy, right? That the width of a man's face can predict how well they or how aggressive they are. People have called that phrenology. And it seems to me that the responses to these kinds of ideas are disproportionate to potentially how much, how unscientific they are. I've also seen people talk about, the Chinese government trying to make a database of faces. Ironically, the Chinese government calls their database of faces the database of Oriental faces. We're not allowed to use the word Oriental anymore. But anyway, there's an Oriental face database. And so if you can look at certain facial characteristics and how they correspond, and people don't even like the idea that their physical form in any way predicts what their personality is going to be like. And so I see all of these manifestations, as manifestations of aversion to control, because
can I ask, is that do you think that is actually it's exacerbated by modernity, like by the from the 60s counterculture onwards? Do you think that there's always something there? If you went back 300-400 years and you told a farmer or a philosopher, an intellectual, stuff like this, they would still have a slight unease, and then that was taken to new heights in the age of individualism. Or do you think actually these people were very different and they might not have had that eeriness about it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So yeah, because of government and social safety nets and networks and infrastructure, there's more different ways to control people than there have been before, right? And so that is a squeeze. Some people even find it creepy, if their Spotify suggests a song that they might like, or or targeted advertising. These are things that people find somewhat creepy.
I have friends who are convinced that Instagram is listening to them because the algorithm is just that good at saying, "Oh, you want a coat," and yesterday, or even like an hour before, they're like, "I need a new winter coat," and they just can't wrap their head around the fact that they're predictable.
It's winter. They were looking at coats last week. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If we evolve to control each other, as I think we do, this is also, this goes back to some other ideas that are unsavory in evolutionary psychology. The idea that men evolved to sexually assault or rape women. Well, if men evolved to sexually assault women, then you would see a counter adaptation such that women avoid men who potentially could rape them. And in similar way, if we evolve to control one another, then we also have adaptations to evade control. And what I think part of our difficulty in understanding human beings, psychology, and the human condition is this inherent evasiveness that we have, where we actually don't want other people to predict us.